And joining me now is Senator Kamala Harris of California, who serves on the Intelligence and Judiciary Committee. She is also notably a candidate for President of the United States. Senator Harris, nice to see you. Thanks for your time.
It's good to be with you. Thank you, Peter.
If I can, let me ask you, several Republicans, as we just reported, now set to join Democrats, including yourself, delivering this rebuke, an embarrassing rejection of the president today with this vote. But he says he's going to veto it. So what do you do then?
Well, listen, we're going to keep, I think, sticking to the point that we cannot afford to put taxpayer dollars into what is essentially a vanity project for this president. We're talking about, Peter, $8 billion that's going to be drawn from the Pentagon for military construction projects. We're talking about a wall that for construction will require taking private landowners' land. Especially in New Mexico and Texas. And there are so many other issues that are pressing issues where American families and working people need resources and need attention. This is a waste of a lot of resources, and it's frankly irresponsible, and it's a political game the president is playing.
Senator Harris, not sure you've had a chance to check your phone or look at a television screen today, but if you did, you likely saw the name Beto O'Rourke come across it. He officially announced that he is running for president today. You've already sent out a fundraising letter naming O'Rourke, saying you look forward to debating him. In this crowded field, do you see him as your main competition?
Oh, I think the voters will decide. But, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Peter, the more the merrier. It'll be a good race.
What do you make of his candidacy? What do you make of Beto O'Rourke, his strengths, his charisma?
I probably have not studied him as much as you have, but I will tell you that I think we have an embarrassment of riches among the Democrats who are running. We have incredible public servants who are smart, whose voices are important, and I think it's going to be a robust and a very healthy process, and I'm looking forward to it.
Let me ask you about him, if I can, then. He spoke to Vanity Fair, and he told them the following. He said, "I totally understand people who will make a decision based on the fact that almost every single one of our presidents has been a white man, and they want something different for this country. And I think that's a very legitimate basis," he said, "upon which to make a decision." What's your response to that, Senator?
Listen, I think that we all need to understand that the American public is smart enough to make decisions based on who speaks their truth, who has a proven record of producing, who knows how to fight for Americans and working people. And it is on that basis that our country will elect its next president.
On this show on Tuesday, the head of the Firefighters Union, a big Joe Biden backer, seemed to believe that the 2020 presidential election will be decided in the Midwest. Here's what he had to say. I want to get your reaction to it.
Okay.
This is going to be decided, quite frankly, in the Midwest. This is going to be decided by those voters, as we say, that when they come home from work, they have to wash their hands or take a shower. Those are the voters that are going to decide Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan and beyond.
Seems to be talking about white working class voters. Given the last election, 2016, was decided by, 100,000 votes over 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Is he wrong?
Listen, I think that there is no question everybody in our country has a lot at stake in the outcome of this race, and everyone is going to be paying attention and will step up. What I've been seeing is I've been traveling the country both in connection with the midterms in 2018, but also with my race, and in particular traveling states like Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada and South Carolina, is that people care about the issues that wake them up in the middle of the night, and they want to know that we have a plan for it. For example, I'm proposing that we restructure the tax code in the United States to lift up families that are making less than $100,000 a year. My middle class tax cut has been described by economists as what would be one of the most significant tax cuts for middle class families in generations. Those are the things people want to hear about, and regardless of where they live, they want to know that the people who are running have them in mind.
Senator, California's governor, your home state, Gavin Newsom, there announced a moratorium on the death penalty. The president responded, calling those on death row stone-cold killers. You say you would support a nationwide moratorium. What do you say to those Americans who believe the death penalty is justified?
Listen, I am, in my entire life, have been opposed and personally opposed to the death penalty. I believe it to be a very flawed system. DNA has proven that there have been people who have been convicted and sentenced to the death penalty who turned out to be innocent. In fact, the numbers I know tell me that 1 in 9 people who have been prosecuted under the death penalty led to an exoneration. This is a sentence that has been disproportionately applied against people of color, and in particular black and brown men in this country. And it is also not a deterrent to the extent that people would argue. I'm a career prosecutor, and I'm going to tell you, I've never seen somebody before they were going to pull the trigger on a gun determine, okay, maybe I will or won't, depending on whether I get life without possibility of parole or the death penalty. So I'm personally opposed to the death penalty, and I applaud what the governor did.
Senator, our time's limited. A couple last thoughts. Former Vice President Joe Biden called Vice President Pence a decent guy. Elizabeth Warren, also in the 2020 field, says that Pence is not an honorable person. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, I disagree with most of what the vice president stands for when he makes decisions about our LGBTQ community in a way that doesn't understand they should be entitled to full equality and all rights under the law as any other American. I disagree with him when he suggests that it's not possible to have meetings with women alone by himself. I think that's ridiculous. The idea that you would deny a professional woman the opportunity to have a meeting with the Vice President of the United States is outrageous. So I have many points of disagreement with the Vice President.
Senator Kamala Harris of California, candidate for President of the United States. Senator, nice to see you. Thanks very much.
Nice to see you. Take care.
All right, we're going to be right back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.